What would you do if the seat you rightfully paid for was taken from you? Not because of a mistake, but because of the color of your skin. What if, at 30,000 feet in the air, surrounded by strangers, your dignity was stripped away in the most humiliating way possible? This is not just a story about a flight. It is about a woman whose calm strength and unshakable dignity turned a moment of blatant injustice into a lesson the entire cabin, and soon the entire world, would never forget. Naomi Sinclair boarded Flight 237 simply as a daughter traveling with her father. But by the time the plane touched down, she would no longer be seen as just a passenger. She would become a voice, a symbol, and a reminder that respect is not a privilege, it's a right. On this flight, a confrontation unraveled that exposed hidden prejudices, sparked raw emotions, and forced every passenger to face a simple question: who truly deserves to belong? Stay with us as we take you inside the cabin, inside the storm, and inside Naomi's heart. And before we begin, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel so you won't miss the stories that make us think, feel, and question the world we live in. The cabin lights were dim, casting a golden glow over the polished mahogany trim and the cream-colored leather seats of first class. The faint hum of the engines reverberated like a steady heartbeat, and for a moment, everything on Flight 782 felt serene. Passengers were settling into their seats, flipping through glossy magazines, tucking blankets under their laps, or closing their eyes for the long journey ahead. But that fragile calm fractured in an instant. "Excuse me, ma'am." The voice was sharp. It carried the authority of someone used to being obeyed. Passengers turned their heads as Caroline Hayes, the lead flight attendant, leaned over row 2A. Her gaze was fixed on the woman sitting by the window, a tall, elegant black woman with soft curls brushing against her shoulders. Naomi Sinclair didn't flinch. She simply looked up from her book, her brown eyes calm but alert. Her father, Edward Sinclair, seated beside her, shifted uneasily in his seat. He was 70 this year, his face lined with time, but his posture still proud. "Yes," Naomi said, her voice even. Caroline's expression tightened. "This seat," she tapped the headrest with her manicured nails, "is reserved for first-class passengers. I'll need to see your ticket, ma'am." For a split second, silence swallowed the cabin. The businessman across the aisle lowered his newspaper. A couple near the back leaned forward, whispering. Naomi closed her book gently, marking her place with a thin ribbon, and retrieved the crisp boarding pass tucked into her jacket. She extended it to Caroline with a polite smile. "Here it is." Caroline glanced at it, her eyes darting over the print, her lips pursing as though something didn't add up. She hesitated, then handed it back. "I'll need to verify this again. Sometimes mistakes happen in booking." Edward bristled. Mistakes. His deep voice carried the weight of insult. "My daughter has been sitting here since we boarded. You didn't ask anyone else to prove themselves twice?" Caroline's jaw tensed. "Sir, I'm just following procedure." But they both knew it wasn't procedure. Naomi knew it. Edward knew it. And judging by the uneasy shifting of bodies in the surrounding seats, the other passengers sensed it too. Naomi placed a gentle hand on her father's arm. "It's all right, Dad," she said softly. She turned back to Caroline. "You can check whatever you need." Her tone wasn't defensive, but resolute, as though daring the woman to continue the charade. Caroline stiffened, clearly unsettled by Naomi's composure. She muttered something under her breath and walked briskly toward the galley, her heels clicking against the carpet. Edward leaned closer, whispering fiercely, "This is outrageous. Naomi, You shouldn't have to put up with this. Do you want me to say something? I'll stand up and... No. Naomi's voice was calm, but firm. She folded her hands in her lap, fingers interlaced like she was anchoring herself. Not now. Her father's eyes searched hers. There was anger in his, but also confusion. He couldn't understand why she was holding back. Naomi offered him a faint smile, one that didn't quite reach her eyes. "We've been here before, haven't we?" she murmured, "just in different forms." Edward looked at her, startled, but before he could reply, Caroline returned, her expression tight with restrained impatience. She carried a clipboard as though it granted her authority. "I'll ask you one more time," she said, her voice louder now, drawing even more attention. "Are you sure you're in the right seat? First class is exclusive? We can't have mistakes disrupting the service." Naomi inhaled slowly. The hum of the engine filled the pause, steady and constant. She could feel her father's anger simmering beside her, feel the weight of dozens of eyes pressing into her back. Every muscle in her body urged her to lash out, to expose the truth in one sharp, cutting sentence, but she didn't. Not yet. Instead, she tilted her head, her voice level. "Yes, I'm sure. My boarding pass says 2A. Would you like me to read it out loud?" Her words were gentle, but laced with steel. A subtle defiance, the kind that revealed strength without raising a single decibel. For a flicker of a second, Carolyn faltered, but pride forced her to recover quickly. "I'll have to consult with the captain," she said briskly. "We'll sort this out." And with that, she turned again, this time marching toward the cockpit. Naomi exhaled, almost silently. She picked up her book, though she no longer read the words. Her father shook his head in disbelief. "She's humiliating you in front of everyone," Edward muttered. His voice cracked between fury and helplessness. "And you're just sitting here." Naomi's fingers tightened around the edge of her book. For a moment, she closed her eyes, and inside, a storm churned. "Why do I let this happen?" she thought. "Why do I stay quiet when every part of me screams to speak?" But another voice answered the one she'd cultivated for years. "Because if I lose control now, they'll say you proved them right. Because sometimes patience is the only shield you have left." When she opened her eyes again, the storm was hidden. She smiled faintly at her father, squeezing his hand. "Trust me," she whispered. Passengers still stared, whispering, watching the drama unfold. No one knew who Naomi really was. No one knew the weight she carried, or the power she could unleash with a single truth. Not yet, but they were about to. Morning sunlight streamed through the tall glass windows of the Sinclair apartment in Manhattan, spilling across the polished oak floors. From the 32nd floor, the city below looked like a restless sea of yellow cabs, honking horns, and hurried footsteps. But inside, it was still and quiet. Naomi Sinclair sat at her desk, her back straight, her focus unbroken as she scrolled through a stack of reports on her tablet. On the surface, the room looked like any modern professional's office sleek desk, ergonomic chair, bookshelves lined with aviation manuals and business strategy texts. But small details gave her away. A framed photograph of a little girl holding hands with her father near a tiny single-engine airplane, a small model jet with the word Sky Nova etched across its fuselage, the prototype of what had become her life's work. On one shelf rested a flight log belonging to her father, worn and frayed, its pages filled with years of entries in careful handwriting. Naomi's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen, sighing. Another board member wanted an urgent update on quarterly forecasts. Another investor demanded reassurance. Another email flagged important with red exclamation marks. It was endless. But Naomi didn't complain. This was the weight she had chosen, the empire she had built with her own hands. Yet, despite the layers of power and success wrapped around her name, there was still one person who had no idea she was the CEO of Skynova Airlines, her father. Edward Sinclair thought his daughter was an executive at an airline, high up but not too high, successful but still under the shadow of someone else's name. Naomi had let him believe it, not because she was ashamed, but because she wanted to protect him. She knew the questions he would ask, the worry he would carry, the disbelief that his little girl had climbed this high. And perhaps, deep down, she wanted to hold on to the innocence of being his daughter, not just the woman who shouldered thousands of employees' futures. As she pushed the tablet aside, Naomi wandered to the window, her arms folded. The city stretched wide before her, but her thoughts drifted miles away. She remembered being 8 years old, sitting cross-legged on the grass beside her father at a small airfield in North Carolina. He had been a mechanic then, not a pilot, but he loved everything about planes. He would point at the sky when jets roared overhead, telling her how the wings cut through air, how lift was created, how engines roared with power. Naomi had listened, her eyes wide, her heart racing. She hadn't just learned science. In those moments she had learned to dream. Edward's love for the skies had been infectious. He never had the chance to pursue a pilot's license life. Bills and responsibility had kept him grounded. But he poured his fascination into Naomi, letting her climb into cockpits at air shows, taking her to aviation museums, sketching planes on napkins at diners. To him, flight was freedom, and he wanted his daughter to believe she could have it. And she did. That belief carried her through engineering school, through sleepless nights working 2 jobs, through the cutthroat world of aviation startups. She had built Skynova from nothing but vision and grit, turning it into one of the fastest-growing airlines in the nation. Investors marveled at her sharp instincts. Employees admired her resilience. And yet, Edward still believed she was simply part of the machine, not the woman steering it. Naomi's phone rang again. She let it buzz before answering. On the other end was her assistant, reminding her of a meeting scheduled in 30 minutes. Naomi agreed politely, but her mind was elsewhere, because the night before, her father had called with a request. "Naomi," he'd said, his voice warm but hesitant, "I've been invited to Atlanta next weekend. Old friends from college. A reunion. I was wondering, do you think you could help me with a ticket? I don't want to bother you, but you always know how to get the best fares." Naomi had smiled, though he couldn't see it. "Of course, Dad. I'll take care of it." She hadn't told him that she already had business in Atlanta that same week. She hadn't told him that arranging the ticket wasn't about finding a good fare. It was about choosing which of her planes he would board, which of her crews would serve him, which of her captains would fly him through the clouds. The irony wasn't lost on her. The man who had given her the love of flight would be a passenger on his daughter's airline, unaware that every detail of his journey existed because of her. That morning, as Naomi prepared her notes for the meeting, she found herself replaying his voice in her mind. She could picture him in his modest living room, the same recliner he'd had for 20 years, the same faded photographs on the wall. Edward Sinclair was a man of simple pride, never one to boast, always steady, always humble. Naomi's chest tightened with a mix of affection and guilt. She wanted to tell him the truth, to watch his eyes widen with pride. to hear him laugh in disbelief. But she also feared the weight of that revelation. Would it change the way he looked at her? Would it turn their bond into something heavier, burdened with expectations? She wasn't ready. Not yet. The intercom buzzed. Her assistant's voice reminded her again. The board is waiting. Naomi straightened her jacket, grabbed her tablet, and walked into the conference room. Inside, 12 faces turned toward her, expectant and calculating. Men in tailored suits, women with sharp eyes, voices ready to dissect every number, every projection. Naomi presented flawlessly, her tone measured, her answers precise. She fielded challenges with grace, parried doubts with data, guided the conversation like a conductor leading an orchestra. And when it ended, they applauded not loudly, but with respect. She returned to her office later, her steps slower, her shoulders heavy. She sat at her desk and glanced again at the photo of herself and her father, her small hand gripping his as they stood near that single-engine plane. 3 days from now, she would fly with him to Atlanta. She had arranged the seats herself, first class. Of course, side by side. She imagined his smile when he sank into the leather, the sparkle in his eye as the engines roared. She wanted him to feel special, to feel the magic of the skies that he had given her long ago. But she also feared what could happen, because Naomi knew the world didn't always see her the way her father did. They saw her skin before her title. They saw her gender before her achievements. They saw her presence in places of privilege as a mistake to be corrected, not a right she had earned. And deep down, she worried, what if this flight, meant to be a simple journey with her father, became something far more complicated? She didn't know then how right she would be. The morning of the flight arrived with a soft drizzle that streaked the windows of Edward Sinclair's modest home. He stood by the door, suitcase in hand, his gray overcoat neatly pressed. His shoes shined as though he were preparing for a ceremony rather than a plane ride. There was a quiet anticipation in his movements, a boyish excitement that even 70 years of life couldn't dull. Naomi arrived just after sunrise, her car gliding to a stop in front of the house. She stepped out, umbrella in one hand, a small smile tugging at her lips as she spotted her father waiting. Edward's face lit up instantly, his entire posture lifting the moment he saw her. Morning, Dad," Naomi said, kissing him on the cheek. "Ready for our trip?" Edward chuckled. "I've been ready for a week. You think I'd miss a chance to see those old fools from college? Not a chance." Naomi laughed softly, taking his suitcase from him despite his protests. She loaded it into the trunk, then opened the passenger door for him. He slid in, grumbling playfully about how he was still capable of lifting his own bags, but his eyes shone with gratitude. As they drove toward the airport, Edward gazed out the window, his fingers tapping against his knee. "Atlanta," he murmured, almost to himself. "Haven't been back there in decades. I wonder if the city will feel the same." Naomi kept her eyes on the road, but glanced at him. "It probably won't," she said gently. "Cities change, people change, but sometimes the memories stay the same." Edward nodded thoughtfully. "You're right. Still, it'll be good to walk those streets again. Brings back so much of who I was, and who your mother was, too." At the mention of her late mother, Naomi felt a pang deep in her chest. She could almost hear her mother's laughter echoing in the car. See the way she used to rest her head on Edward's shoulder. It reminded Naomi that family wasn't just about the present. It was about carrying pieces of the past forward. They arrived at the airport amid the usual chaos of travelers rushing with rolling suitcases, announcements crackling through speakers, children tugging at tired parents' hands. Naomi guided her father through the check-in process with practiced ease. When the attendant printed their boarding passes, Edward glanced at the bold letters, "First Class." "Naomi," he whispered, his brows rising. "You didn't?" She smiled. "Of course. I did. You deserve it." His lips parted, but he said nothing for a long moment. Then, quietly, he murmured, "Your mother would be proud of you." Those words, simple as they were, pierced Naomi's heart. She felt a warmth spread through her chest, a blend of sorrow and pride that left her momentarily speechless. She squeezed his hand in silent acknowledgement before leading him toward security. They breezed through the priority lane, something Edward had never experienced. He looked around in awe, half expecting someone to tell him there had been a mistake. But Naomi held herself with such certainty, with such grace, that no one questioned them. To everyone else, they looked like they belonged exactly where they were. In the lounge, Edward marveled at the plush chairs and complimentary breakfast spread. "This isn't an airport," he joked. "This is a hotel lobby. What do people even pay for out there?" He gestured toward the crowded terminal. Naomi laughed, watching him sip orange juice with the delight of a child discovering something new. She was glad, so glad to give him this experience. It was such a small taste of what she had built, and yet he remained blissfully unaware of how deep her connection to it all truly ran. When their flight was called, they boarded first, stepping into the hushed elegance of first class. Edward's eyes widened as he sank into the wide leather seat, his hand gliding across the armrest. "Lord have mercy," he said softly. "I've lived 70 years, and I've never seen anything like this." Naomi smiled, her heart swelling. "Get comfortable. Dad, this is your day." He leaned back, adjusting his seat, glancing at the other passengers trickling in. There was an older couple seated across the aisle, Eleanor and Walter Green, who nodded politely. A businessman in a sharp navy suit, Victor Hale, was already typing furiously on his laptop 2 rows ahead. Everyone seemed to belong, and for the first time, Edward felt as though he belonged too. As the last passenger settled, the hum of conversation filled the cabin. Flight attendants moved gracefully, stowing bags, offering drinks, and then Caroline Hayes appeared. Caroline's smile was rehearsed, her movements efficient, but when her gaze landed on Naomi and Edward, something shifted. Her eyes narrowed just slightly, her smile stiffened. She approached their row with deliberate steps. "Good afternoon," she said. Her tone clipped. "May I see your tickets? Please." Naomi blinked, taken aback. "We've already been seated." Caroline's lips curved into a strained smile. "Yes, I can see that. But sometimes mistakes are made. First class is a very exclusive space. We can't afford to have any errors." Edward straightened in his seat, his brow furrowing. "Are you suggesting we don't belong here?" The passengers nearby shifted uncomfortably, sensing the tension. Eleanor Green frowned, whispering something to her husband. Victor Hale lifted his eyes briefly from his laptop, curiosity flickering across his face. Caroline's smile didn't waver. "I'm simply asking to confirm, for everyone's sake." Naomi exhaled slowly, the memory of her earlier thoughts returning like a warning. She had feared this moment, feared the way the world sometimes insisted she didn't belong, even when she had earned her place 100 times over. She reached into her bag, producing the boarding passes once again. She handed them to Caroline with a calm expression, though inside, her heart beat faster. Caroline examined them, then handed them back with the faintest sigh. Thank you. I'll just need to double-check with the captain. Edward's face flushed. This is ridiculous, he said sharply. You didn't ask anyone else to prove themselves twice. Naomi placed a steady hand on his arm. It's all right. Dad, she whispered. Let it go for now. But Edward shook his head, his voice low and trembling with restrained anger. No, Naomi, it's not all right. Not when they look at you and decide you don't deserve to be here. Naomi's gaze softened. She knew his anger wasn't just for her. It was for decades of small humiliations, for years of being told, wait your turn, or not for you. He had carried those wounds silently, and now he was watching them reopen on his daughter. Caroline walked briskly toward the cockpit, her heels clicking against the carpet. The passengers watched her leave, a ripple of unease spreading through the cabin. Naomi closed her eyes briefly, willing herself to stay calm. She thought of her mother's words, spoken long ago. Strength isn't always about fighting the loudest. Sometimes it's about knowing when to wait. And so she waited, her father's hand trembling in hers, the cabin silent except for the hum of the engines. She didn't know yet how explosive the next few minutes would become, but deep down, she could feel it. The storm was only beginning. The cabin grew unnervingly quiet after Caroline disappeared behind the cockpit door. Naomi sat still, her spine straight, her fingers curled tightly around her father's hand. The hum of the engines filled the silence, but beneath it pulsed an invisible tension. Passengers shifted in their seats, some pretending not to notice, others openly curious. Edward's chest rose and fell quickly, his jaw set, his dignity, worn like armor all his life, now felt pierced. Naomi, he whispered, his voice low. Why did she single us out? We showed our passes like everyone else. Naomi gave his hand a reassuring squeeze. Because some people see only what they want to see. Dad, it doesn't matter what you hand them on paper. Edward shook his head, anger simmering in his eyes. This isn't right. They don't get to treat you like this. Before Naomi could respond, Eleanor Green, the older woman across the aisle, leaned slightly forward. Her voice was gentle but steady. She didn't ask us for our tickets, Eleanor said. We boarded just the same as you, and no one questioned us. Her husband Walter nodded in agreement, his expression stern. It wasn't right, he had, his tone carrying the weight of decades of fairness ingrained in his bones. Naomi offered them a grateful smile. Thank you, she said softly. Victor Hale, the businessman 2 rows ahead, closed his laptop and turned slightly. I noticed it too, he said matter-of-factly. There was no reason to question you. It was clear discrimination. Edward's lips pressed into a tight line. He wanted to explode, to raise his voice and call the injustice for what it was. But Naomi's calm presence beside him anchored him. He swallowed his anger, letting it smolder quietly instead. The door to the cockpit opened, and Caroline reappeared. Her expression was neutral, carefully controlled, though her eyes flickered with something harder. She approached Naomi and Edward once more, her voice polite but cold. The captain has confirmed the seating chart. She announced, It seems you are listed correctly in first class. Edward glared at her. Seems you mean exactly as it should be. Caroline tilted her head slightly, as though indulging him. Yes, sir. Exactly as it should be. But I must remind all passengers that we expect courtesy and cooperation. This is a professional environment. Naomi's lips parted, a retort forming on her tongue. But she stopped herself. She could feel the weight of every passenger's gaze pressing against her back. She knew what Caroline was doing, framing them as disruptive when all they had done was exist. Caroline gave a thin smile and turned away, continuing down the aisle to offer drinks to other passengers. Her manner with them was suddenly warmer, almost exaggerated, as though to prove a point. Naomi exhaled slowly. She leaned closer to her father. "Don't let her take your peace. Dad, that's what she wants." Edward's shoulders slumped. "I've seen this before. Too many times. I thought maybe, just maybe, the world had changed more than this." Naomi placed her hand over his. "It has changed, but not enough. Not yet." Moments later, Caroline returned with a tray. She offered drinks to Eleanor and Walter, then Victor, each time smiling brightly. When she reached Naomi and Edward, her smile thinned again. "Would you like champagne or sparkling water?" she asked. Naomi's voice was steady. "Sparkling water, please, for both of us." Caroline handed over the drinks, her fingers brushing the edge of the glass with deliberate slowness, as if testing Naomi's composure. Naomi accepted them without flinching. Passing one to her father, Edward lifted the glass, his hand trembling slightly. "To dignity," he whispered. Naomi clinked her glass softly against his. "To resilience," she replied. The flight soon lifted off, engines roaring as the plane ascended above the drizzle and into the sunlight. For a brief moment, the view out the window stole Edward's attention. Clouds stretched endlessly, the earth fading beneath them. His expression softened, awe washing over him. "It never gets old," he murmured. "The sky. It always feels like freedom." Naomi watched him, her heart swelling. She wanted so badly for him to hold on to this wonder, untainted by the ugliness they had just endured. She wanted the memory of this trip to be about joy, not humiliation. But Caroline wasn't finished. Half an hour into the flight, she returned again. This time, she leaned down slightly, her voice low but audible enough for nearby passengers to hear. "Miss Sinclair, there have been some concerns raised about your behavior." Naomi's brows furrowed. "My behavior?" "Yes," Caroline said smoothly. "Speaking harshly to crew, creating unnecessary tension. We cannot allow disruptions in first class." Edward's face reddened instantly. "That's a lie. She hasn't done a thing wrong. You've been provoking her since we boarded." Naomi's calm cracked slightly. Her voice, though still measured, carried steel. "I have not been disruptive. What you're doing is unprofessional, and frankly, unacceptable." Caroline's lips curved into a small, almost triumphant smile. "I'll make a note of your response, ma'am. But please understand, the safety and comfort of all passengers is our priority." She straightened and walked away before Naomi could respond. The cabin buzzed with murmurs. Eleanor leaned toward Naomi. "Don't let her get away with this. She's trying to build a case against you." Victor Hale nodded grimly. "Document everything. If she writes you up, you'll need witnesses." Naomi felt the pressure mounting, a storm gathering inside her chest. She closed her eyes for a moment, inhaling deeply. She couldn't afford to lose control, not in front of her father, not in front of these strangers. But inside, her thoughts raced. Was this how it always had to be, that no matter how much she achieved, no matter how hard she worked, someone would always try to put her back in her place? Her father touched her arm, his eyes glistening. "Naomi, listen to me. You've done more in your life than I ever dreamed possible. Don't let this woman make you doubt yourself." Naomi met his gaze, her throat tightening. She saw the weight of his years, the battles he had fought quietly, the hope he had carried into her life, and in that moment, she knew she couldn't let him see her break. The flight continued, but the air felt heavier, charged with unspoken conflict. Every time Caroline passed their row, the tension sharpened. Naomi sat tall, her chin lifted, her presence unshaken. But inside, she braced herself, because she could sense it. Caroline was not finished. The confrontation ahead would be fiercer, sharper, and impossible to ignore. The hours in the sky stretched longer than they should have. Every minute seemed to stretch into a test of patience, a measure of how much Naomi could endure without letting the cracks show. Caroline's footsteps echoed faintly each time she crossed the aisle, her presence heavy, deliberate. She seemed to orbit their row like a hawk circling prey, waiting for the chance to swoop. Naomi sat motionless, her gaze fixed on the window where the endless blanket of clouds drifted beneath them. Her father shifted beside her, his jaw clenched, his knuckles pale against the armrest. He had been silent for nearly half an hour, but she could sense the storm brewing inside him. Finally, Edward leaned closer, his voice low but burning. "Naomi, I've had enough of this. She won't stop until she humiliates you in front of everyone." Naomi exhaled slowly. "I know, Dad, but if I fight her now, she'll twist it. She wants me to lash out." Edward's chest tightened with frustration. "So what do we do? Just sit here and let her trample all over us?" Naomi turned toward him, her expression soft but resolute. "We wait. Sometimes the best way to win is to let the truth reveal itself." She's digging her own hole. Before Edward could respond, Caroline appeared again. This time, her smile was gone, replaced by a mask of officious concern. She crouched slightly, leaning in as if addressing children. "I'm afraid we've had several complaints," she announced, her voice just loud enough for surrounding passengers to hear. "Other travelers have expressed discomfort with the tone of your interactions." Naomi blinked, stunned. Complaints. From whom Caroline straightened, her chin tilted upward. "That information is confidential, but as the lead flight attendant, it is my duty to maintain order in the cabin. If you cannot cooperate, I may have to ask you to step aside when we land." Edward's temper flared. "Step aside. We paid for these seats. My daughter has done nothing wrong, and you know it." Caroline's eyes narrowed, her voice sharpened like a blade. "Sir, please lower your voice. Shouting only makes matters worse." Naomi placed a hand on her father's arm, feeling the heat of his anger vibrating through him. "Dad, please," she whispered. But inside, she too was shaking, fury clawing at her composure. Eleanor Green finally rose from her seat, her voice trembling with indignation. "Excuse me, but this is absurd. I've been sitting here the whole time. This young woman has done nothing to disrupt anyone. If there were complaints, they didn't come from us," Walter added firmly. "And they didn't come from me either. What you're doing is wrong. Plain and simple." Victor Hale stood as well, adjusting his suit jacket. "If you're taking notes, make sure you add mine. I've been watching closely, and the only disruption I've seen is yours. Miss Hayes, you've been targeting them since before we left the ground." The cabin hushed, all eyes turning toward the confrontation. Caroline's cheeks flushed, but her mask didn't slip. She forced a thin smile, her voice now dripping with false politeness. "Thank you for your input, sir. But as crew, my responsibility is to..." Naomi's voice finally broke through, calm but ringing with quiet authority. Your responsibility is to ensure the safety and comfort of all passengers. That includes us. My father and I are entitled to the same respect you've shown everyone else." For a brief moment, Caroline faltered. The air seemed to shift as passengers around them murmured in agreement. But then her expression hardened again. "I'm only doing my job. Ma'am, if you feel mistreated, you're welcome to file a complaint after the flight." Naomi's eyes locked with hers, unflinching. "I will." Carolyn spun on her heel and walked away briskly, her shoes clicking against the aisle carpet. The tension in the cabin lingered like smoke after a fire. Edward let out a shuddering breath, his hand trembling in his lap. "I can't stand it. Naomi, watching her treat you like you're less than anyone else." Naomi leaned against her seat, exhaustion pressing down on her shoulders. "I know, Dad, but we're not less. That's what matters. They can try to convince themselves otherwise, but it doesn't change who we are." Her father's eyes glistened, a sheen of unshed tears threatening to spill. "When I was your age, I used to dream of a world where you wouldn't have to fight these battles. I thought maybe my children, my grandchildren, would live freer than I did. But here we are, still in the sky, still treated like we don't belong." Naomi reached over, taking his hand in both of hers. "Dad, your dreams weren't wasted. You raised me to stand strong, to know my worth. That's what matters. They can't take that from us." The plane shuddered lightly as turbulence rippled through the cabin. Overhead bins rattled, and a few passengers gasped. The captain's calm voice came over the speaker, instructing everyone to remain seated. Naomi felt the irony of it all. Even as the world above the clouds jolted and shifted, she and her father had to sit steady, anchored in dignity. As the turbulence passed, Eleanor leaned across the aisle once more. "My dear, don't let her rattle you. People like that thrive on power plays. But the truth is, the rest of us see it. We know what's happening." Naomi nodded gratefully. "Thank you. It means more than you know." Victor Hale cleared his throat. "If she continues, I'll be filing a formal statement with the airline. I suggest others do the same." Walter Green added, "And so will we." For the first time since boarding, Naomi felt a flicker of hope. She wasn't alone in this. The weight she carried, the constant need to prove her right to exist, to belong, was being shared, even if only for a moment. But beneath that hope, the tension still simmered. Caroline's retreat hadn't ended the battle. It had only postponed the inevitable. Naomi could sense it in the way Caroline avoided their row, in the sharpness of her movements, in the set of her shoulders. She wasn't finished. Naomi closed her eyes, steadying her breath. She knew the breaking point was near. The question wasn't if it was when, and when it came, she would need every ounce of strength, not only for herself, but for her father, for the passengers who had stood by her, and for the truth that demanded to be seen. The cabin dimmed as the sun began to sink beyond the horizon. Shadows stretched across the aisles, painting faces in warm gold and soft gray. Edward leaned back, weary but resolute. Naomi rested her hand over his once more, grounding him, grounding herself. In the fading light, the air seemed charged with anticipation. Something was coming, something that would shatter the fragile calm and force the truth into the open, and Naomi was ready. The cabin lights brightened slightly as dinner service began, but no one was focused on the food. The earlier turbulence had settled, leaving behind an uneasy calm. Every passenger could sense it. The storm hadn't passed. It was only circling, waiting to strike. Caroline Hayes returned, tray in hand, her face tight with a smile that looked practiced, not real. She moved briskly down the aisle, offering plates to passengers with rehearsed warmth. When she reached Naomi and Edward, her demeanor shifted again, the warmth evaporating. "Chicken or pasta?" she asked sharply. Her tone clipped. Naomi met her eyes. "Chicken, thank you." Edward spoke more slowly, his voice steady despite his simmering anger. "Pasta, please." Caroline placed their trays in front of them, but her hands lingered a beat too long, as though she wanted to assert control in even this simple gesture. Naomi felt her jaw tighten, but kept her composure. She would not give this woman the satisfaction of a reaction. "Across the aisle," Eleanor whispered to Walter, her voice carrying just enough. "She's baiting them again." Caroline froze for the briefest moment, then stood tall, her smile returning like a mask snapped back into place. "Is there a problem, Mrs.?" Green Eleanor lifted her chin. "Only if fairness is a problem." The murmurs in the cabin grew louder. A few passengers who had been silent now leaned forward, clearly invested in the unfolding drama. The air was charged, the kind of tension that crackled just before lightning split the sky. Caroline stepped closer to Naomi's seat, her voice dropping, but her words pointed. "Miss Sinclair, I must insist again that you maintain proper decorum. Your behavior is being noted." That was it. Naomi felt the fire rise within her, the years of quiet endurance reaching their edge. She unbuckled her seatbelt and stood, her figure tall against the narrow confines of the cabin. "My behavior." Her voice was calm, but it carried, reaching the rows behind her. "I have sat quietly. I have answered respectfully. I have done nothing but endure the way you've singled me out since the moment I boarded this plane. If you're making notes, make sure they reflect the truth." Gas rippled through the cabin. Passengers craned their necks, some nodding in agreement. Caroline's cheeks flushed crimson, but her voice sharpened. "Sit down, ma'am. You're disturbing other passengers." Naomi didn't flinch. "The only disturbance here is the way you've treated me and my father, and everyone here knows it." She gestured slightly to Eleanor. "Walter, Victor, and the others watching closely. We are not invisible. We are not voiceless. Not anymore." Edward rose beside her, his hand trembling, but his voice resolute. "I'm an old man, but I've seen enough in my life to know when someone is abusing their position. What you've done tonight is shameful." Victor Hale stood as well, straightening his jacket. "I'll be reporting this. You've overstepped, Miss Hayes, and I won't be the only one." The murmurs grew into a chorus. A woman from the back called out, "She's right. We've all seen it." Another voice added, "Enough is enough." Caroline's face hardened, but for the first time, her composure cracked. She glanced toward the cockpit, as if silently calling for backup, but the passengers weren't retreating into silence. They were rallying. Naomi felt her heart pounding, her palms slick, but her voice stayed steady. "You wanted to make me small. You wanted to reduce me to nothing but a disruption. But here's the truth. My presence is not a threat. My dignity is not negotiable. And I will not be treated as less." The cabin erupted in scattered applause. It wasn't loud or coordinated, but it was enough. Enough to tip the balance, enough to make it clear that the tide had turned. Caroline's lips pressed into a thin line. She muttered something about reporting procedures and passenger conduct, but her words were drowned out by the support rising around Naomi. Naomi slowly lowered herself back into her seat, her father following. Her hand still trembled slightly, but she felt lighter, as though a weight had lifted from her chest. She hadn't wanted this confrontation, but maybe it had been necessary. Maybe silence had never been enough. Edward looked at her with pride shining through his weary eyes. "That's my girl," he whispered. Naomi closed her eyes briefly, inhaling deeply. She could feel every pair of eyes still on her, every mind replaying what had just happened. But instead of shrinking under the attention, she held her head high. This wasn't just about her. It was about every moment like this, every person who had been told they didn't belong. As the applause faded and the cabin settled into uneasy quiet, Naomi knew this wasn't the end. The real storm was still waiting when the plane landed. But for now, in this suspended world above the clouds, she had drawn a line, and she wasn't alone anymore. The cabin had grown heavy with silence after the confrontation. Even the hum of the engine seemed sharper, like a background score holding its breath. Naomi sat upright, her father's hand resting near hers, their fingers not quite touching, but close enough to exchange strength. Passengers stole glances in her direction, some with quiet admiration, others with unease. But all of them were awake now, aware of the line that had been crossed. Caroline Hayes retreated toward the galley, her composure fraying at the edges. Her steps were quick, clipped, her hands tight around her notepad. She scribbled furiously, as if the act of writing could restore her authority. But every word felt hollow. She had lost control of the narrative, and she knew it. When she returned, she stood tall in the aisle, addressing the cabin in her best professional voice. "Ladies and gentlemen, I must remind you that this is a commercial flight, and order must be maintained. Disruptions of any kind will be documented and addressed upon landing." Her words floated in the air, but they fell flat. Passengers exchanged knowing looks, whispering quietly to each other. Caroline expected obedience, but the spell of her authority had broken. Naomi leaned toward her father, speaking softly. "Do you hear that no one's buying it anymore?" Edward's lips curled into the faintest smile. "That's what happens when truth breaks through. Even the loudest voice can't drown it out forever." Caroline moved closer, standing over Naomi as if proximity could reassert dominance. "Miss Sinclair, I am giving you a final warning. If you continue this behavior, you will be reported directly to the captain as a safety risk." Naomi's breath caught in her chest, but she forced her voice to remain calm. "A safety risk. For sitting in my assigned seat, eating my meal, and answering your questions. If that's the definition of risk, then perhaps the risk is not me." A quiet ripple of agreement stirred among the passengers. Eleanor Green spoke clearly from across the aisle. "She is not the risk here, and you know it. What's dangerous is when people abuse power to humiliate others." Walter nodded beside her, adding, "We're not children. We've all seen what's happening." Victor Hale's deep voice joined in. "If you insist on involving the captain, then do it. Some of us would like his opinion on this matter." The suggestion hung in the air like a challenge. Caroline's eyes flickered nervously toward the cockpit door. For the first time, she hesitated. Calling the captain meant accountability. It meant an authority higher than her own would weigh in, and she could already sense the outcome would not favor her. Naomi, watching closely, felt a strange mix of anger and pity. Anger for the way Caroline had treated her and her father. Pity because she saw now that this woman's cruelty came from fear. Fear of losing control. Fear of being seen for what she was. "Call him," Naomi said, her voice quiet but firm. "Let's have this conversation openly." Gasps spread again, this time from the audacity of the request. Caroline's lips parted, but no words came out. Her authority was collapsing in real time, like a building whose foundation had cracked beyond repair. At last, Caroline turned stiffly, walking toward the cockpit. The murmurs grew louder, tension building like pressure in a sealed cabin. Naomi sat back, her pulse racing. She hated the spectacle, hated that her dignity had become a performance for strangers. But at the same time, she knew this confrontation had meaning. It was bigger than her. It was a mirror, reflecting truths that too often remained hidden in shadows. Her father squeezed her hand gently. "You've already won, Naomi. Whatever happens next, you stood tall." She closed her eyes, whispering to herself, "I just want it to end with truth." When the cockpit door opened, Captain Richard Lawson stepped out. His presence filled the aisle, calm yet commanding. His uniform was crisp, his posture steady. Conversations hushed instantly. All eyes turned to him. "Good evening," he began, his voice warm but firm. "I've been informed of some concerns. I'd like to hear them directly." Caroline straightened, her voice sharpened once more. "Captain, this passenger has been argumentative, disruptive," and Naomi rose before she could finish. Her voice cut clean through the air. "Captain, my name is Naomi Sinclair. I am sitting in the seat assigned to me. I have complied with every request. The only disruption here has been the way I've been singled out since the moment I boarded." The captain studied her for a long moment, his eyes calm but assessing. He turned then to the other passengers. "Can anyone here confirm what they've observed?" Eleanor stood immediately. "She's telling the truth." Walter rose as well. "I confirm it," Victor added. "So do I. This is a clear abuse of power." Others nodded, some speaking softly, some firmly. The chorus grew undeniable. Carolyn's face drained of color. "Captain, surely you can't take their word over mine. I will take the truth wherever it comes from," Captain Lawson replied evenly. He turned back to Naomi. "Miss Sinclair, you are within your rights. Please remain seated and continue to enjoy your flight." The applause this time was louder, stronger, a wave of support that filled the cabin. Naomi felt her chest tighten, emotion rising like a tide. She sat slowly, her hands trembling with release. Caroline, meanwhile, stood frozen, her authority shattered before the very people she had tried to control. She excused herself quietly, disappearing back toward the galley, the eyes of the passengers following her like shadows. For the first time in hours, Naomi felt air move freely in her lungs. The weight that had pressed against her ribcage lifted, if only a little. She leaned against the headrest, her father's hand clasping hers with pride and relief. But deep down, she knew this wasn't over. The captain's intervention had saved the moment, but the real reckoning still lay ahead, and she was ready to face it. The applause slowly died down, leaving behind an echo that still vibrated in the air. Naomi felt the weight of dozens of eyes, but instead of shrinking, she let herself breathe into it. Her hands trembled in her lap, but her shoulders remained square, her chin lifted. Captain Lawson returned to the cockpit, his presence like a stabilizing anchor. The cabin shifted into uneasy quiet again. People returned to their meals. Some whispered softly, but no one could shake what had just happened. Naomi reached for her glass of water, her fingers brushing the condensation. Edward leaned close, speaking in a low voice only she could hear. "I don't think she's finished with you," Naomi sighed. "I know, but neither am I." For several minutes, the only sounds were the clinking of utensils and the steady hum of engines. Then Caroline reemerged. Her face was pale, but her eyes still carried that spark of defiance. She walked directly to Naomi's row, ignoring the passengers' murmurs. "Miss Sinclair," she said, her tone laced with forced civility, "since you've made such a spectacle of this, perhaps you'd like to share with everyone why you believe you deserve to sit here. After all, not everyone can afford this cabin." A collective gasp swept the aisle. The remark wasn't just cruel, it was calculated. She wanted to strip Naomi bare, to reduce her dignity to a question of money, of worth. Naomi inhaled sharply, her pulse quickening. Every instinct told her to stay silent, to let the moment pass. But she had reached the edge of silence. She stood slowly, turning not just to Caroline, but to the entire cabin. Her voice was steady, rich with quiet power. "You want to know why I'm here? Fine, I'll tell you." Her gaze moved across the rows, meeting the eyes of passengers who leaned forward, captivated. "I am Naomi Sinclair. I didn't just buy this ticket. I am the CEO of SkyNova Airlines, the company that owns this plane, the company that pays your salary. Ms. Hayes." The words landed like thunder. Shock rippled through the cabin. Forks froze mid-air. Eleanor clutched Walter's hand, her mouth falling open. Victor blinked, almost laughing at the absurdity of what he was hearing. Caroline's face drained of all color. She took a step back, her lips parting but no sound emerging. Naomi continued, her voice still calm, but carrying the force of truth. "I didn't want to say it. I never board a flight announcing who I am. I don't sit in this seat because I demand privilege. I sit here because I paid for my ticket, like everyone else. But sometimes, when silence only enables cruelty, the truth has to speak for itself." The cabin erupted in whispers. Some passengers gasped audibly. Others exchanged wide-eyed looks of disbelief. The revelation reshaped the entire story. What they had witnessed wasn't just prejudice. It was prejudice against the very woman who held the keys to the airline itself. Caroline stumbled backward, her breath shallow. You can't be Victor Rose." His deep voice cutting in. "Oh, she is. I've read about you. Forbes, Business Today, even the airline industry journals. I remember the headline, 'Naomi Sinclair takes the helm of SkyNova at 35. I thought the photo looked familiar when I boarded." The confirmation hit like a second wave. Passengers shifted from disbelief to awe. Some even began to clap again, not in mockery this time, but in genuine recognition. Naomi didn't bask in it. She didn't smile or gloat. She simply looked back at Caroline, her expression calm but unwavering. "Now you know, and maybe next time, before you judge someone's worth by the color of their skin, you'll think twice." Caroline's mouth opened, but no words came. Her chest rose and fell rapidly, panic creeping across her face. She glanced toward the cockpit, then back at Naomi, as though searching for an escape route. Edward stood now, his voice steady, proud. "My daughter didn't want to humiliate you. She tried to endure it quietly, but you pushed too far, and now everyone knows the truth." A ripple of agreement surged through the cabin. Eleanor stood, her voice strong despite her years. "We stand with her. What you did was wrong." Other passengers chimed in. "That was shameful. Unacceptable. She deserves an apology." Caroline backed away, her posture collapsing. Her earlier bravado was gone, replaced with visible fear. She muttered something about needing to speak with the captain and retreated again. Naomi lowered herself into her seat, her breath shaky, but her presence still commanding. Edward squeezed her hand, whispering, "I've never been prouder." She gave him a small smile, though her heart still raced. The revelation had cost her something: her preference for privacy, her shield of anonymity, but it had also reclaimed her dignity. And more importantly, it had planted a seed in every passenger who had witnessed it. For several minutes, the cabin buzzed with hushed conversation. Passengers sneaked glances at Naomi, some nodding at her in quiet respect. Victor leaned slightly across the aisle. "You handled that with more grace than most people could ever muster. I hope you know that." Naomi inclined her head. "Thank you." But deep down, she was still conflicted. She hated that it had taken a declaration of power to validate her worth in these people's eyes. She hated that her title had been the final proof, rather than her humanity alone. The thought gnawed at her even as relief washed over her body. Edward noticed the shadow in her expression. "What's wrong?" he asked softly. Naomi shook her head. "It shouldn't have mattered who I am. CEO, passenger, stranger. It shouldn't take a revelation to be treated with respect." Her father's eyes softened. "You're right. But sometimes the truth has to shock people awake before they see what they should have known all along." Naomi let his words settle, staring out the window at the endless night sky. Somewhere below, cities twinkled like scattered constellations. Up here, above the clouds, she had spoken a truth that could not be unsaid. The cabin began to calm. Passengers returned to their meals, though the atmosphere was forever changed. Respect hung in the air now, fragile but real, and in the galley, Caroline Hayes sat alone, her hands trembling, her world collapsing around her. The revelation had not just changed the balance of power on this flight. It had drawn a line in the sand, one that would carry consequences far beyond the clouds. And Naomi knew this was only the beginning. The revelation still lingered in the air long after Naomi sat down. Conversations were hushed, but the energy was undeniable. A truth that had been buried under prejudice had erupted into the open. And now the cabin felt charged, like the stillness after a storm, where the air hums with static. Naomi pressed her hands together in her lap, the tremor in her fingers betraying the calm she tried to project. Her father's presence steadied her, but her mind churned with conflicting emotions. She had always wanted her work to speak louder than her identity. Yet here she was, forced to announce her title like a shield against humiliation. Passengers kept glancing her way, some with awe, some with embarrassment, others with quiet solidarity. Naomi felt their eyes like weight on her shoulders. She wasn't sure if they saw her as a woman vindicated or as a symbol of something larger. Maybe she was both. Eleanor Green leaned slightly across the aisle, her voice gentle but firm. "You did the right thing, dear. Don't ever doubt that. Sometimes truth is the only language people will understand." Naomi offered a faint smile. "Thank you. I didn't want it to come to this," Walter added, his tone warm. "Maybe you didn't, but you handled it with dignity, and that matters more than you realize." Victor Hale, still seated a row behind, leaned forward. "It matters a great deal, Ms. Sinclair, not just for you, but for every person who has ever been underestimated." Naomi gave a small nod, but her heart remained restless. These voices of support were comforting, but she couldn't shake the sting that it had taken her title, her wealth, her power to be seen clearly. What about those who didn't have that armor? Caroline, meanwhile, had disappeared again into the galley. Though she was out of sight, her presence lingered like a shadow. Passengers whispered about her, speculating what might happen next. Some wondered if she would be disciplined. Others shook their heads, muttering that it was disgraceful she had treated anyone that way, let alone the owner of the airline. Edward leaned closer to Naomi. You know this isn't just about you anymore. Everyone on this plane has seen something they won't forget. Naomi looked at him, her voice low. I know, and I'm glad the truth is out. But part of me wishes it didn't have to be revealed like this. I never wanted to wield my position like a weapon. Her father's eyes softened. You didn't wield it as a weapon. You wielded it as a shield. And there's a difference. Naomi let his words sink in. She wanted to believe him, but part of her still wrestled with guilt. The applause, the recognition, it all felt hollow when she thought of the millions of people who couldn't rely on a title to protect them from humiliation. The captain's voice came over the intercom, smooth and steady. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be continuing our flight as scheduled. I ask everyone to remain calm and respectful for the remainder of our journey. Thank you. His tone was diplomatic, but everyone knew the message carried a pointed subtext. Respect was no longer optional. Naomi leaned back in her seat, closing her eyes briefly. She wished for quiet, for a moment of stillness where she could process everything. But peace was fleeting. The sound of footsteps approached again. Caroline? She appeared in the aisle, her uniform immaculate, but her posture brittle. She stopped near Naomi, her eyes darting nervously across the cabin before settling on her. The silence was heavy. Every passenger was listening. Miss Sinclair, Caroline began, her voice stiff. I would like to apologize for earlier. Gas rippled again, this time softer, as though the passengers couldn't believe the words had left her mouth. Caroline's apology wasn't smooth. Her lips trembled, her tone uneven. I was wrong to question your right to be here. I was wrong to treat you the way I did. I let assumptions guide my actions, and for that, I am deeply sorry. Naomi studied her carefully. Part of her wanted to dismiss the apology as hollow, as something offered only under the weight of exposure. But another part of her, stronger, quieter, recognized the crack in Caroline's armor. Thank you for saying that, Naomi said evenly. But you should know, my dignity doesn't come from my title. It comes from the fact that I am a human being, deserving of respect like anyone else. You owe the same courtesy to every passenger, not just the ones who happen to own the airline. Caroline's cheeks flushed. She swallowed hard, nodding once. Then she retreated, her steps brisk, almost stumbling as she disappeared again. The passengers exchanged murmurs, some approving, some contemplative. Naomi sat down slowly, her chest tight. She wasn't angry anymore. She was tired of carrying the burden of proving her worth. Edward reached for her hand. You turned that moment into something more powerful than revenge. You gave her a chance to see herself. That takes strength. Naomi exhaled softly. I just hope she learns from it. Victor spoke again, his tone filled with admiration. You didn't just defend yourself. Naomi, you gave everyone here a lesson in what grace under fire looks like. And I'll tell you, it's a rare thing. The cabin settled into a quieter rhythm after that. Meals were cleared, lights dimmed, and the hum of the engines became the backdrop once more. Yet the atmosphere had shifted permanently. Passengers no longer glanced at Naomi with suspicion or dismissal. Now their looks carried respect, curiosity, even a hint of reverence. Naomi didn't want reverence. She wanted equality. But maybe, she thought, this was the first step. As the plane soared through the night sky, Naomi allowed herself a moment to lean back, her eyes closing briefly, her father's gentle breathing beside her, the softened murmurs around her, the steady rhythm of flight, all of it grounded her in the present. But she knew the storm wasn't entirely over. The revelation had given her strength, but it had also exposed her in a way she could never take back. Tomorrow, the world might hear about what happened on Flight 237. Reporters might call, headlines might swirl, and once again her name would be used as a symbol in a conversation larger than herself. For now, though, she let herself rest. Not as a CEO, not as a public figure, just as Naomi Sinclair, daughter of Edward, a woman who had fought to sit in her rightful place and had chosen truth over silence. And as the stars glimmered outside the window, Naomi whispered silently to herself, "This isn't just the end of a fight. It's the beginning of change." The cabin lights had been dimmed for the night, casting everything in a gentle glow. The hum of the engines was steady, but inside Naomi Sinclair's chest, a storm raged on. She leaned against the headrest, her eyes fixed on the small oval window where stars streaked faintly across the dark sky. The world looked peaceful from this altitude, but her mind was anything but. Edward was already dozing beside her, his hands folded over his lap. His breathing was slow and even, a rhythm Naomi envied. She wanted to slip into that same stillness, to let exhaustion pull her under. But her thoughts clawed at her relentlessly. For the first time in years, she felt exposed. Her identity had been ripped into the open, not by choice, but by necessity. She replayed the confrontation with Caroline Hayes over and over again. The humiliation, the stares, the suffocating silence, and then the moment she finally declared who she was. The words had rolled off her tongue like armor, but now they felt heavy, almost burdensome. Why did it have to come to that, she wondered? Why do I have to prove my worth by wielding power? Why can't my humanity be enough? She remembered the way the passengers' faces had shifted when she announced she was the CEO. Shock, then respect, as if her worth had just been recalculated, as if everything they had witnessed was only validated because of her title. That truth hurt more than Caroline's cruelty. Victor Hale's earlier words echoed in her mind. You didn't just defend yourself. You gave everyone here a lesson in grace. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe she had turned the ugliness into something meaningful, but inside, doubt gnawed at her like restless turbulence. Her father stirred beside her, opening one eye. You're not sleeping. Naomi smiled faintly. Neither are you. Apparently. Edward shifted, his voice raspy with fatigue, but still full of warmth. I've been your father long enough to know when your mind is fighting itself. Naomi sighed, letting the truth slip. I keep wondering if I did the right thing, or if I just reinforced the idea that respect has to be earned through status. Edward turned fully toward her, his expression soft but firm. Naomi, people like Caroline didn't disrespect you because they didn't know your title. They disrespected you because they refused to see your humanity. That's on them, not you. Naomi's chest tightened. But Dad, when I spoke the truth, that's when everything changed. That's when they finally saw me. Her father reached for her hand, his thumb brushing gently over her knuckles. They should have seen you from the moment you walked on board. That they didn't isn't your burden to carry. The fact that you revealed who you are doesn't diminish your dignity. It exposes their blindness. His words calmed her in a way nothing else could. She leaned her head against his shoulder, letting herself breathe. Sometimes I wish I could just be invisible. Just another face in the crowd. No titles, no expectations. Just me. Edward chuckled softly. Invisible. My Naomi. Even as a little girl, you walked into rooms and people noticed. Not because of who you'd become, but because of who you were. You've always had presence. Don't ever wish it away." Naomi smiled, her heart easing slightly, but the unease never fully left. She thought of Caroline again, her pale face, her stammered apology. Was it genuine or just survival? Could people like her ever change, or did they only bend under the weight of exposure, as if summoned by Naomi's thoughts? Caroline reappeared briefly in the aisle, refilling water cups for passengers. She avoided Naomi's row, her posture stiff, her eyes fixed anywhere but on the woman she had humiliated. Naomi caught a glimpse of her profile, the tension in her jaw, and for the first time felt something unexpected. Not anger, not triumph, pity. Caroline looked small now, almost fragile. A woman who had wrapped herself so tightly in superiority that when it unraveled, there was nothing left to hold her up. Naomi exhaled, realizing that while Caroline had wounded her, Caroline herself was now trapped in a cage of her own making. Her father noticed the look in Naomi's eyes. "What are you thinking?" Naomi shook her head. "That she probably hates me right now, but not for what I did, for what I revealed about her." Edward nodded slowly. "Some truths break people open. Sometimes that's the only way they can rebuild differently." Naomi stared out the window again, letting the words wash over her. She thought of all the passengers watching silently, each carrying their own reflections of what had happened. Maybe some would walk away unchanged, but maybe others, like Eleanor, like Victor, would carry the lesson forward. She closed her eyes, letting the hum of the engines lull her into something close to rest. Images drifted through her mind her first day as CEO. Her mother's smile when she graduated, her father's steady voice telling her she was enough. These memories anchored her, reminding her that her identity wasn't defined by this flight alone. A sudden jolt rocked the cabin as turbulence shook the plane. Gas filled the darkened cabin, seatbelts clinking as passengers gripped their armrests. The seatbelt sign dinged, and Captain Lawson's voice crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated with your belts fastened. We're experiencing a patch of turbulence. Nothing to worry about." The plane rattled again, sharper this time. Naomi instinctively reached for her father's arm. He patted her hand gently. "See, even in the sky, storms pass." Naomi let out a shaky laugh. "That might be the most dad thing you've ever said." The turbulence eased, and the cabin relaxed. Passengers chuckled nervously, their fear dissolving back into the quiet rhythm of flight. But for Naomi, the turbulence felt symbolic. A reminder that even above the clouds, storms had a way of finding you. She leaned back in her seat, closing her eyes once more. Her thoughts finally began to slow. Not with certainty, but with acceptance. She couldn't control how others saw her. She couldn't control whether Caroline's heart had truly changed. All she could control was her own integrity, her own response. As the engines droned steadily, Naomi whispered silently to herself, "Tomorrow will come, and when it does, I'll face it with the same strength I face tonight." With that, she finally allowed sleep to take her. Her father's steady presence beside her, the stars still glowing faintly beyond the glass. And though her heart had weathered turbulence, Naomi Sinclair knew one thing with certainty she would not break. The hours slipped by as the plane pressed onward through the night sky. Most of the passengers had drifted into uneasy sleep, their bodies curled against pillows or slumped in seats, lulled by the steady rhythm of the engines. But Naomi Sinclair lay awake, her eyes tracing the faint outlines of the cabin ceiling above her. She had slept briefly, But dreams had pulled her into restless fragments, shadows of voices, echoes of judgment, applause that turned into silence. Every time she closed her eyes, she relived the confrontation with Caroline Hayes, the moment the cabin turned against her, then for her, then fell into stunned awe when she revealed her identity. The memory wasn't fading. It was seared into her mind like a scar. Beside her, Edward stirred again. His eyes opened with the same paternal instinct he had carried for nearly 7 decades. "You're still awake," he murmured, voice gravelly with fatigue. Naomi forced a smile. "I don't think my mind is ready to land, even if the plane is." Edward gave a soft chuckle. "You've carried storms heavier than this. Naomi, you'll land just fine." She turned her face toward him, studying his features softened by age, but still marked with quiet strength. "I just wonder how many storms I have to weather before people stop questioning if I belong." Her father's gaze deepened. "Maybe they'll never stop. But belonging isn't theirs to grant you, it's yours to claim. Tonight, you did that. Not just for yourself, but for everyone who's ever been told they don't deserve a seat." Naomi inhaled deeply, her chest tightening with emotion. She wanted to believe him, wanted to let his words wrap around her like armor. Yet she also knew the world outside this plane was waiting the press, the whispers, the interpretations that might twist her truth into something unrecognizable. As dawn began to stretch faint fingers of light across the horizon, the cabin slowly stirred. Attendants moved quietly through the aisles, distributing breakfast trays. Caroline reappeared, her posture straighter now, though her eyes still avoided Naomi's. She placed trays on the tables of Eleanor and Walter Green, who thanked her politely, but without the warmth they had shown earlier. Respect had shifted in the cabin, and Caroline was no longer at its center. Naomi accepted her tray silently. Caroline set it down without meeting her eyes, her lips pressed tightly together. Naomi studied her, catching the flicker of strain in her expression, the way her hands trembled as she moved to the next row. Victor Hale leaned forward again from behind. "You realize the story of this flight isn't staying on this plane." "Right." His tone was calm, but there was an edge of inevitability in it. Naomi sighed. "I know. By tomorrow, or maybe even before we land, someone will have posted about it. People will argue about what happened. Some will support me. Some will defend her. And the truth will be stretched thin between them." Eleanor, her white hair haloed in the soft morning light, spoke with quiet conviction. "The truth doesn't disappear just because people twist it. Those of us who saw what happened will carry it forward honestly," Walter added. "And even if the story changes outside, what happened inside this cabin can't be erased. People felt it. They'll remember." Naomi nodded slowly, her heart touched by their assurance, though her doubts lingered. She wasn't afraid of being known. She had lived most of her adult life in the spotlight. But this moment was raw, personal, different. It wasn't about her company, her strategies, or her leadership. It was about her dignity as a human being, and that felt infinitely more vulnerable. The captain's voice came over the intercom, steady and formal. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're beginning our descent into New York. Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened and your belongings are secure." The cabin shifted with the announcement trays collected, seats adjusted, seatbelts clicked into place. The hum of the engines deepened as the plane angled downward, leaving the endless sky behind for the sprawling world below. Naomi's pulse quickened. She knew the descent wasn't just physical. Every mile closer to the ground was a mile closer to consequences, to conversations she couldn't avoid, to choices she would have to make. Her father placed his hand over hers again. "You're ready for whatever comes. Don't forget that." She smiled faintly. "You make it sound easy." "Not easy," Edward replied softly, "but necessary, and you've never shied away from what's necessary." The cabin rattled briefly as the plane cut through a pocket of rough air. Passengers tensed, then relaxed as it steadied. Naomi exhaled, her mind echoing with the turbulence she felt inside. For a brief moment, she closed her eyes and imagined what might await them at the gate. Would reporters already be gathered? Would passengers scatter silently, afraid to be involved? Or would they stop and speak to her, affirming what they had witnessed? She didn't know, but she sensed something irreversible had begun on this flight, and when the wheels touched the ground, she would no longer be just Naomi Sinclair, private traveler. She would once again be a symbol, a headline, a conversation. The city skyline emerged faintly in the distance, blurred by morning haze. The sight grounded her, reminding her of all the mornings she had woken with determination, prepared to face boardrooms, negotiations, decisions that carried the weight of hundreds of lives. She was strong enough for those. She would be strong enough for this. The seatbelt sign chimed again. Passengers straightened, quiet anticipation filling the cabin. Naomi reached into her bag and pulled out a small notebook, a habit she had carried since her college days. She flipped it open, pressing her pen to the page. Words flowed quickly, almost without thought. Dignity is not granted by power. It is claimed by truth. Tonight, the sky reminded me of that. May I never forget it. She closed the notebook as the landing gear deployed, a deep mechanical thud reverberating beneath them. Edward glanced at her, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Writing always did clear your storms." Naomi chuckled softly. "Maybe not clear them, but it gives them shape." The runway came into view, stretching long and steady beneath the plane's nose. Naomi gripped the armrest lightly, her heart racing but her posture calm. The engines roared louder. The wheels screeched against asphalt. And in a surge of momentum, Flight 237 touched down. Applause broke out in pockets across the cabin, a customary release of tension. But this time it carried a different resonance. Relief, yes, but also acknowledgement. The end of a journey that had been far more than miles traveled. As the plane slowed, Naomi inhaled deeply. Her father's words, the passengers' voices, Caroline's apology, all of it converged inside her like a mosaic of lessons. She didn't know exactly what awaited her beyond the gate, but she knew she would face it not as a victim, not even as a CEO, but as herself whole, resilient, unshaken. And as the plane taxied toward the terminal, Naomi Sinclair whispered silently, "The sky tried to test me tonight, but I didn't fall. I flew." The cabin was hushed except for the clicking of seatbelts and the shuffle of passengers preparing to leave. Flight 237 had rolled to its final stop, the engines winding down with a low, steady whine. Outside the windows, the morning light spilled across the tarmac, illuminating the gleaming metal of other aircraft lined up in neat rows. Naomi Sinclair sat still, her hand resting over her father's. She could feel Edward's steady pulse beneath her fingertips. His calm presence had been her anchor through the chaos. And now, as the seatbelt sign switched off with a soft ding, she let herself breathe. Passengers began rising from their seats, stretching stiff limbs and tugging luggage from overhead compartments. Conversations buzzed quietly at first, then louder, voices tinged with relief and anticipation. But Naomi noticed something else, eyes flicking toward her, hesitating, lingering. Some were filled with respect, others with uncertainty, but all carried the weight of what had transpired during the flight. Caroline Hayes moved down the aisle slowly, her usual briskness gone. She assisted passengers with their bags, her voice subdued, her posture restrained. She approached Naomi's row, pausing as if unsure whether to speak. For a moment, her lips parted, but no words came. Instead, she lowered her gaze and continued past, her silence saying more than any apology could. Victor Hale leaned over his seat, lowering his voice. "Naomi, you should know people will talk. What happened here won't stay contained, but maybe that's not a bad thing." Naomi met his eyes. "I know, but I don't want the story to be about me. I want it to be about what it revealed." Victor nodded slowly. "Then make sure that's the story you tell first, before anyone else twists it." Naomi absorbed his words, realizing their truth. She had the power to shape this narrative, not by controlling it, but by grounding it in honesty. Eleanor Green leaned across the aisle, her hand brushing Naomi's lightly. "You were grace itself, dear. People like me will remember, and will speak of it." Naomi's throat tightened. "Thank you. That means more than I can say." As the line of passengers shuffled forward, Naomi and her father remained seated. Edward squeezed her hand gently. "You've already won, Naomi. The rest is just noise." She gave him a small smile, though her heart pounded. She knew the moment she stepped into the terminal, she would no longer be just a daughter traveling with her father. She would be Naomi Sinclair, the CEO whose dignity had been tested in the skies. When it was their turn, Naomi rose, pulling her bag from the overhead bin with practiced ease. Edward steadied himself with his cane, standing tall beside her. Together, they moved down the aisle. The air felt charged, heavy with unspoken acknowledgement. A few passengers offered small nods. Others gave faint smiles. Naomi accepted each one quietly, her posture steady, her gaze forward. At the front of the cabin, Captain Richard Lawson stood near the exit, his cap tucked under his arm. His eyes met Naomi's with a look of respect deeper than formality. "Ms. Sinclair," he said softly, "thank you for the way you handled yourself tonight. You reminded us all what leadership really looks like." Naomi inclined her head, her voice calm but warm. "Thank you, Captain. Safe skies to you." Stepping into the jet bridge, Naomi felt the cool rush of air from the terminal beyond. The hum of voices grew louder, mingling with the clatter of rolling suitcases. Her pulse quickened as she glimpsed figures at the gate: journalists, cameras, curious bystanders. The story had already spread faster than she'd imagined. Edward leaned closer, his voice low. "Are you ready?" Naomi straightened, her chin lifting with quiet resolve. "I've been ready my whole life, Dad, even when I didn't realize it." They walked into the terminal together. Flashes from cameras sparked instantly. Reporters calling her name. Microphones extended. Questions flew at her from every angle about the flight, the confrontation, her identity. For a heartbeat, Naomi considered slipping past them silently, protecting herself from the storm. But then Victor's words echoed in her mind. "Make sure that's the story you tell first." She stopped, turning to face the crowd. Her father stood firmly beside her, his presence a steady reassurance. Naomi raised her voice, clear and steady. What happened on this flight was not about titles or power. It was about dignity. No one should have to prove their worth to be treated with respect. Not me, not my father, not anyone. The skies belong to all of us, And so does humanity. The terminal quieted. The frenzy of reporters stilled for a moment as her words settled into the air. Naomi held their gaze, unwavering. I didn't speak tonight because I wanted recognition. I spoke because silence would have meant acceptance. And I will never accept disrespect toward me or toward anyone else. Her voice softened, but her conviction deepened. If this story travels, let it carry one message. We are all worthy of kindness. We are all worthy of respect. That truth doesn't require a title. It requires courage. For a moment, there was silence. Then, slowly, a ripple of applause began among passengers who had exited behind her. Eleanor and Walter clapped softly. Victor's hands joined, and soon the sound spread, filling the terminal with something larger than spectacle solidarity. Naomi's eyes shimmered, but she did not waver. She turned back to her father, who looked at her with pride so profound it needed no words. Together, they walked toward the exit, leaving behind the flashing cameras, the murmurs, the chaos. As they stepped into the sunlight outside the terminal, Naomi felt the weight of the night lift. She had not sought this fight, but she had faced it, and though it had shaken her, it had not broken her. Her father's voice was gentle, almost reverent. You didn't just land a plane today, Naomi. You landed the truth. Naomi smiled softly, the morning light warming her face, and the truth will keep flying long after this. The city stretched before them, alive with noise and promise. Naomi knew the story of Flight 237 would ripple outward, but she also knew it would not define her. What defined her was the choice she made to stand, to speak, to claim her dignity not as a privilege, but as a birthright, and as she walked into the new day. Naomi Sinclair carried with her not just the memory of turbulence, but the certainty of calm skies ahead. As Flight 237 touched down, the journey didn't end, it transformed. What began as a humiliating act of discrimination became a powerful reminder of resilience, dignity, and truth. Naomi Sinclair did not fight with anger, nor did she crumble under injustice. She stood, calm yet unyielding, showing the world that respect is not granted by titles or status, but claimed through courage. This story is more than one woman's struggle in the sky. It is the story of countless others who have been silenced, dismissed, or pushed aside simply because of who they are. And tonight, on this flight, silence was broken. Naomi's voice carried not just for herself, but for every person who has ever been told they do not belong. As you sit with this story, let it remind you discrimination may wound, but dignity can heal. Prejudice may divide, but truth can unite. And though turbulence shakes us, it is calm resolve that lands us safely. If this story moved you, let it stay with you. Carry its lesson forward, because change begins not just in headlines, but in hearts. Thank you for watching. If this touched you, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel. More stories await, stories that will challenge you, inspire you, and remind you of the humanity we all share.